start with approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes for the agenda today? All right, seeing none, the agenda is approved. So moving on to approval of our meeting minutes from May 1st. Does everyone have those in front of them, or do we need to put them up on the screen? Would anyone like to move the meeting minutes?
Move to approve.
Kathleen with a motion, is there a second?
Alyssa will second.
Alyssa will second. First and a second, any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And that carries, thank you. Is there anyone from the public here today that would like to address the committee? All right, seeing none, then we will move on to the tab report.
Thank you, Chair. TAB met May 15th. For the Chair's report, Hovland reported that the legislature did not propose changes to the Metropolitan Council governance. For the MnDOT report, Connie Sabjam reported that construction season has started and wants assistance in reminding the public that the work is being done for them and not to them. For the MPs, so any help that you can help with them with that. For the Pollution Control Agency, there was no report. For the Metropolitan Airports Commission report, Carl Crimmins reported that Aer Lingus is flying 4 flights to Dublin. Also, Delta Airlines has added direct flights. And the airline passengers have now exceeded 2019 passenger levels. Metropolitan Council report, Deb Barber reported that the first quarter ridership was 12.5 million passengers, an increase of 15%. And arterial BRT ridership is up 31%, and express ridership up 16%. And the last TPP advisory work group meeting was on Friday, May 17th. For the Suburban Transit Association, Gary Hansen reported that the Maple Grove Transit MyRide microtransit service capacity and hours were expanded effective May 1st. MVTA microtransit ridership is up 31% over a year ago. And they're having plans to add zero-emission and autonomous vehicles to their service to Scott County in Prior Lake and Shakopee, late 24 or early 2025. And then for business items, TAB approved the program year extension request for Washington County's CSAH 17 and Minnesota 36 intersection improvement project. They approved for public comment the regionally significant tip amendment request for US 10 expansion. They approved the scope change request for Metro Transit's regional mobility hubs project. They approved 2 streamlined tip amendments for 2 projects from MnDOT, and also for the 6 new NEVI projects that were added. They released the draft of the 2025 through 2028 tip for public comment. For information items, they had significant discussion on the regional solicitation evaluation work groups and the 2024 funding scenarios. For the evaluation, Hovland reported on the policymaker work group. The meeting covered the role of the working group and some refresher on the history of the solicitations and an update on what's coming forward on listening sessions. Members offered potential questions to ask at the peer agencies review coming up meetings. They had discussion on regional solicitation evaluation goals, and members emphasized the need to coordinate with the updated TPP and 2050 regional development guides. Other suggestions that they asked to be considered: the solicitation should express a clear intent on where to spend money and why it's important to fund. The solicitation should clearly explain why certain data points are critical for application performance. Some categories have high scoring criteria, and why do these matter? Make sure that all metrics are valuable and help achieve goals. For the active transportation work group, Glenn Johnson reported that the work group has so far met 4 times. With the feedback they received from TAB, they left their recommendation at spending $15 million for active transportation within the 2024 project selection. The group discussed what geographic equity looks like. They reviewed the maps where projects are located that are proposed to receive the active transportation funding. Minneapolis had 4 projects qualifying for this funding, and they volunteered that 2 of the projects could receive federal funding to provide more entities to receive the active transportation funding for the pilot project. The group will be talking about requirements of the legislation, and especially what the complete streets requirement is, as not all regional solicitation applicants have streets. Work going forward will discuss potential 2025 application and also the 2026 solicitation. And the group will be reviewing the MnDOT's active transportation applications. For the 2024 regional solicitation scenarios, Steve Peterson presented information on the 3 funding scenarios and requested feedback. Hennepin County noted that there was not much deviation for the safety scenario versus the midpoint scenario, and that more over-programming funding added more trail projects versus pedestrian and safe routes to school projects. And then there were 2 other items that were not covered, the transportation funding overview and the scope change policy update, because they did not have time, and therefore TAB will be meeting starting at noon next week. The meeting's been moved up a week, and in also July, they're going to start at noon so that they have plenty of time to cover all the items.
Any questions on the TAB report? All right, thank you, Elaine. So we will move next to committee reports. Executive committee did meet this morning, and we discussed the action items that are before us today. We also spent some time talking about the regional solicitation funding options. As Elaine just noted, TAB will be meeting next week, and then funding and programming will begin taking up the actual action item for the regional solicitation funding options. So today's conversation with this group will be important so that we can share some direct feedback from this committee to TAB next week to help them provide some direction into finalized scenarios that can go before the committees in the decision-making process. So just setting the stage for that conversation coming up here a little bit later on our agenda. Any questions about that part? Otherwise, I will have Robbie walk us through the 2 streamlined tip amendments for today. All right, thank you, Robbie.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair and members. Again, so I'm Robbie King. I'm a planner with MTS here at the council. And before I start this morning, I just want to congratulate Joe on his birthday today. So I have 2 items to present to you today. The first item is 2024-28. It's a streamlined 2024-2027 tip amendment request for 2 project adjustments. So the first project is a Dakota County is requesting dividing its Veterans Memorial Greenway Trail project in Eagan and Inver Grove Heights into 2 phases. This project will construct a multi-use trail, pedestrian bridge, pedestrian underpass, and boardwalk for 3.6 miles. With this request, the total project cost would decrease from $15 million to $13.8 million. Attached to the bottom of the action transmittal, you'll see a map. Can represent how this project is being split up. On the left side is phase 1, program year 2025. This is the original state project number. The new state project number is split, and this is the reason for the tip amendment request. Into phase 2 is the green line for program year 2026. Discussions with the project sponsor, they'd like me to highlight that for their construction project, there is a middle section of this trail, which is actually phase 1 for their construction. It's currently under construction now. Phase 2 would be what we are referring to as phase 1 here for this tip amendment request, and then their phase 3 is marked here as phase 2 for our purposes. And then the second project to consider here for change is the City of Minneapolis is requesting an addition of an intersection to its intersection improvements project at various intersections on LaSalle, 15th Street, and Nicollet Avenue. This project will rebuild signals and construct ADA-compliant curb extensions. The requested project adjustment is to add an additional intersection at 15th Street and Willow Street and increase the total project cost from $4.35 million to $4.85 million. Attached to the bottom of the action transmittal is a map representing these intersections. There are 6 original project intersections and 1 added intersection with this requested change at 15th Street and Willow Street. The recommended motion in front of you is that the Technical Advisory Committee recommend adoption of an amendment to the 2024-2027 TIP to adjust these two projects. And I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Robbie. Are there any questions on this item or anyone who would like to move it forward?
Madam Chair, I'll move it forward.
Thank you, Joe. We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have a first and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? That carries. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is 2024-29. It's a streamlined TIP amendment request for MnDOT's US 169 and CSAH 9 and Minnesota 282 Interchange Improvements Project. So the project sponsors request an amendment to the 2024-2027 Transportation Improvement Program to increase the cost and change sponsorship for parts of an interchange improvement project at those intersections previously mentioned and add a new locally funded roundabout. The request includes a sponsorship change from Scott County to MnDOT for one part of this project and the addition of a new locally funded roundabout at CSAH 9 and Valley View in Jordan. The original project cost is $39.6 million. Funded by $24 million and change from federal highway and $15.5 million in state and local funding. The requested amendment is for a total cost increase to $54.8 million, including an increase in federal funding of $4.34 million and an increase in state funding to $10.1 million. Table 1 summarizes the funding sources. So the total line on top of that table represents the total cost of the proposed change. And then the regional solicitation line is just indicating that that part of the project is not changing, and that is the funded portion of the project that was funded through regional solicitation. The recommended motion in front of you is that the Technical Advisory Committee recommend adoption of an amendment to the 2024-2027 TIP to increase the cost and change the sponsorship for parts of an interchange improvement project at US 169, CSAH 9, and Minnesota 282 in Jordan, and add a new roundabout. I stand for questions.
Thank you. Are there questions on this item or anyone would like to move this forward?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Lyndon. Is there a second?
Second. Tag?
Thank you. There's a first and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? That carries. Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you.
And that concludes the executive committee report. Next on the agenda is the planning committee. Gina is not here today and there were no items at planning committee. Jed is here if there are questions on the TPP working group. Otherwise, we will move on to funding and programming. So let me know if you have questions. All right, seeing none, we will move on to funding and programming then, Michael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At our meeting in May, we moved forward the TIP, the comment for 24-27, and then we spent most of the meeting talking about the different funding scenarios, so similar to what we're doing here today. But for the item, for the TIP, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Chair and Chair. So you've got on your agenda page the TIP, which is 500 and some projects and 100 and some pages. I'm sure you are familiar. So I'll just briefly talk a bit about the TIP. I didn't have a presentation this year, but it's as most of you know, a couple new faces here. TIP's a 4-year list of transportation projects funded in whole or in part with federal funding. Any federally funded project must be there along with what we define as regionally significant projects. In fact, that's pretty rare, but we do have a locally funded table at the back of the TIP for the first time in my memory for a couple of projects. And this is something that we all do, all MPOs do, I should say. And all these projects get through the TIP process. They end up in the Minnesota STIP. Any federally funded project to receive federal funds must be in the Minnesota STIP, which reflects, at least in this region, our TIP. So this isn't particularly different from last time. We have next, I think 2 weeks from yesterday, we have a public comment or a public meeting, virtual public meeting for comments. We usually get about 10 people at those. Our public comment period ends on July 1st, and then TAB will review the public comments in August because we do need that time to put together what is usually a lot of public comments and then you'll see the council approve this in mid-September. And then it goes through federal reviews with FTA and FHWA, and usually gets approved about November 1st. That date is not set in stone, but it's usually somewhere around November 1st. It looks like it's usually looked about $6.2 billion, about half of, not half, but highway and transit amounts are taking up the majority of that, about the same amount for each, and then there's other modes that take up a smaller piece of that. And that's really all I have. But if anybody has any questions about the tip or the process, I stand for them.
Any questions on this item?
Just one question, Madam Chair.
Go ahead,
For the
Linda.
current projects that we're evaluating this round, will those go into this?
Only if we fund anything for fiscal year 2025, then we would have to amend them in at a later time. Otherwise, they would go into the next tip 2026 to 2029. Are we funding 25?
The reason I asked that, Madam Chair, is the greenhouse gas assessment process begins February 1st, 25. So I thought we were hoping that we could
Usually work.
program those in, the ones that are selected this time, before that kicks in.
It's an important thing to think about. Go ahead, Elaine.
Typically, what we did last time is we had a tip amendment to add those projects that were funded with earlier funds. So we would probably do that either December or January, or get it started even in November, because that's typically when the tip
That was
is-
essentially my response, but Linda's asking a bit of a different question about projects that might be in as late as 2028 or amending them in to sort of beat that February deadline that, and so that's a question that I will proudly say is probably above my head.
Yeah.
So it's not about the year of the funding, it's about when a project gets put into the TIP, correct, in the legislation? Okay, yeah, could Met Council staff please follow up on that for us?
Yeah, so, thanks, Madam Chair. So there's only a few projects on our list that would be subject to that new law. So it's trunk highway expansion or interchange projects. So there's only a few projects on the list, and I believe all of those that are under consideration are going into this draft tip, so they wouldn't need an amendment. We could do an amendment for some of those. If we want to bring in the money, it would be a regionally significant amendment, so it would take a public comment period to do that tip amendment, which we could do. But there may be a reason this fall to do a few, because we do have some earlier money, 26 money, particularly for carbon reduction. So there may be some projects that we would want to get into the tip anyway this fall via an amendment. Because if they want to get started sooner, even than maybe perhaps that program year. So there could be an opportunity for an amendment, I guess, is the summary there. But I don't think any projects that need to meet that February 1st deadline would necessarily need an amendment for that purpose.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
Is the legislation specific to which STIP or just has to be in the current?
No,
Go ahead, Steve.
yeah, Madam Chair. So it has to be in the STIP by February 1st, 2025. So it doesn't say which years. Yep. It doesn't say like last year's or this year's or
Bill had his, do you still have your hand?
Yeah, if we're done with that, I have a
Different question? Okay, then I'll go over to Innocent.
Yes, Madam Chair, before the new bill was enacted, MnDOT and MPCA had some agreement probably about 3-4 years ago to do detailed greenhouse gas emission analysis for projects that made the like regional significant projects that are probably about a mile or more that add new lanes, So they have been doing that, and those were included in most of the environmental impact statement projects that were large enough to require that. So could be that could be used because we had kind of similar restriction and requirement for mitigation. So probably even those that are not required for 2025, maybe those could be also be looked at and qualify for use for, if you want to do the tip amendment or so, because we have already been doing that for the past 4 years. So.
Okay. Thank you. I assume there might be some concern just with how projects were scoped and estimated and applied for, which was probably not in full consideration of the new law, and so that might be some of the concern with the timing of when these projects get introduced in. Lyndon, am I?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so, so you're speculating, and you'll bring back some more information on the process for those projects, maybe at our next meeting? Okay, all right, thank you. Anything else on that aspect of?
Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
just a process question. So when this goes out for public review, as comments come back, any change to anything in the tip will require an amendment process? Like if the public comes back and said, no, I don't want to do this project, or I think we should change it, or like, it should be in a different year, how do those comments apply to the tip?
Joe or Steve?
Let me make sure I follow that. Can you repeat that? I'm not following.
Yep, so in a public comment period, when we get comments back on the tip and all the projects that are in it, and anything from what year project is assigned, or whether someone thinks it's a good project or a bad project, or things should be changed, how do those comments get responded to? And let's say it's a simple year change. No, we don't think it's gonna be ready by whatever year. That's an amendment, right? The project sponsor would have to go through, if they agreed, they'd have to go through an amendment process.
Members and chair, we don't usually get those kind of comments in the tip. A simple year change in the tip is actually not an amendment. That's just an administratively done modification. So the tip is really a reflection of what's in the tip, not necessarily of when everything falls. So if something during the public comment process were to meet the threshold of what would other times of year be an amendment, I think TAB could probably make a change if it really wanted to. That would be a little unprecedented. But usually if the comment is, it's not going to be ready in this year, that comment is probably from the sponsor. And then after the tip's approved, it would probably be an administrative modification.
Thanks.
That does touch on kind of the interesting process that we have before us here, where we are approving this pending public comments. So TAB will see those final public comments. Bill?
Thank you, Chair. I know this is similar process to how we've done it in the past, but I'm not fully comfortable with recommending the tip without having seen the public comments. I know the public comments have not really raised issues in the past, but there's a possibility that they could raise significant issues that we hadn't foreseen with regard to TPP conformance. I'd really prefer to delay this vote until after that. But at a minimum, I'd request that staff, if you have any comments that fall into that category, that you bring it to our July meeting so we could consider maybe making an additional recommendation on those issues.
Go ahead, Ali.
For the process, the public comments don't typically come through the committees anyway. So even if TAB hadn't released it and waited till next month to release it, the comments would go directly to TAB. They wouldn't come through the committees.
And I think they should come through the committees. I think we would benefit from seeing them.
Go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Bill makes a good point, and maybe I recall you maybe said something similar last year, right? And so I'm trying to remember how we played that out last year, because I think we had committed to, if there's any technical comments that come through the public comment period, that we would cycle those back through the committee either at the next meeting or via email? Was that
At one of the meetings.
at the next meeting? I think that's a fair request to make if there's a technical comment that requires technical consideration that, right, Joe? That's kind of what we did last year.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So the public comment period ends on July 1st, and that's one of the difficulties of this process is there's a 45-day public comment period. I'd anticipate a couple of hundred comments, and we just can't have those prepared for tab even in July, much less funding attack. But I think we can have the comments, the raw comments, if we think are pertinent to tack on the 3rd. We'd have to walk them in because we'll probably get 100 comments on July 1st.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
So more to my question as well is we're Metro Transit in the middle of our regional network planning process and how we expand our service, kind of recovering from the last few years of workforce challenges. We have a couple projects. One of them is in 2025, which is next year, and we're trying to sort out when those would happen. So we may want to adjust years for when those happen. There's two projects, one's service and one's a potential BRT and Highway 55. So the question I have is, what's the right time and approach for adjusting the year? It's not necessarily changing the scope, but it's really about when do we actually have that readiness to implement?
I think you can tell us any year changes you have whenever you'd like. If it's during the public comment period, TAB can probably recommend approval of the TIP to the council with those changes. If it's a bigger change, we might have to do an amendment after the process. It's a little unusual. This is a tough time of year to be doing that, but I think with a year change, we can make that change pretty swiftly at almost any time you'd like after the TIP's approved, because it's like a 1-week process tops, or even at this point.
Madam Chair, so the challenge for us is our public comment period for Network Now is going to be it's going to end up being September, October after this, but it'd be good to get ahead of this if we know the likelihood of how these are going to sequence. So that's kind of the reason we've been like, are we going to change it or do we not change it? And I think what I'm seeing is it's better to push it out at this point, but I'll have to confer with staff and see where we're at.
I think if you know something before the end of the comment period, it makes sense. If not, again, a year change is going to be a pretty swift process whenever you do it, except when we're in this period between the public comment period and approval of the TIP from FHWA and FTA, it gets a little harder to make changes. So that's a couple of months in the fall. We can also talk offline about where you think you're at.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Elaine.
I want to clarify, we're talking about non-regional solicitation projects when you're talking about the year? Otherwise,
Yes. Well, yeah, if there's
the
regional
other-
solicitation projects, then we're talking about the
coming in for a
process here
program,
with
program year
program
extension.
year policy. But I was under the impression you were not talking about solicitation.
Is there any other kind that Metro Transit? I don't think we have any non-regional solicitation projects.
Oh, well, that is a different question then.
But they're all on the tip.
Yeah, that is a different question, because then there's a process, but that process can probably occur any time, and then it would be reflected in the TIP after the fact.
Right, I just want to sequence things. I don't have a problem going through process. It's just making sure we're coordinated.
Thank you for clarifying, Elaine. For solicitation projects, we still do have the program year policy process to go through.
Thank you.
Any further questions on this item, or is there anyone who would like to move it?
I just have a question. Steve or Joe, I don't think I can recall in the past when public comments is serious enough to necessitate making a new, like a modification or amendment of the tip. In the past, if you read most of the comment that we receive normally about maybe a couple of people will say they do not need, there are too many highways projects and spending more on highways, we should be spent on transit or bike or some other types of modes. And that's normally what we normally receive, but I don't know if you can recall, in the past, if we have someone that was serious enough to require amendment or serious modification.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
thanks.
Steve.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and it's a good question. Joe and I can only recall one time when, since we've been here and for 10 years, where we've removed a project as a result of the public comment period, and it was a regional solicitation-related trail project that for kind of a variety of reasons tab pulled. But a lot of the comments or questions we get, we either pass on to the sponsors and they can help us through that, or we bring those comments forward to, our next funding, our next regional solicitation, or into the policy plan. So we do use a lot of the public comments that are policy-based for future endeavors, but the TIP isn't a great decision-making tool. It's a record of other decisions that have been made by various bodies or the state, and it's an accounting of that. It's not a great decision-making tool to pull vast amounts of money this way or that way. That's just not the way we do it. But we do take the public comments and we do use those, but it's rarely used to kind of pull specific projects in or out.
Go ahead, Brian.
Just for clarity's sake, Steve, if I understand you right, you're saying that was pulled based on public comment? Or was that a tab choice in approving the TIP?
Yeah, Madam Chair and Brian, so the project was, and I don't want to get too much into the details here, but it was based on public comment and some cost estimates that were off by an order of magnitude of 3 or so. And I think the combination of the public comments, not enough project development, what'd you say, Joe? Kind of swayed that. Don't want to disparage the project here, I'm trying not to, but.
I think the public comments unwittingly exposed a scoring error, and it was sort of a very strange scenario that I wouldn't anticipate being repeated a lot.
I just, in my experience, I haven't seen public comments produce much change in the TIP. I think that there are processes, to Adam's question about people submit comments for technical corrections and all of that stuff that are non-regional solicitation. So, I think as a board, as a committee, I don't have any concern with moving it forward. The sequencing of things is a little weird, but to Elaine's point, not much of it comes back, and this body's ability to course correct or whatever advised tab is going to continue to be limited by our ability to advise tab on much of anything, I'd say. But so with that, I would make a motion to move it forward.
Second.
All right, thank you. We have a first and a second. Any further discussion on this item? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? All right, that passes. Thank you on that one. And Michael, if it's okay, when we get through kind of Steve's maybe overview of the regional solicitation, if you want to share some general feedback from funding and programming's conversation, you could do that at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. So then with that, I will ask Steve to walk us through where we're at with the regional solicitation.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. The reason we pulled you all in today here to have a good discussion, and Madam Chair, you can help the conversation, as I know you will too, as to what we're trying to do. But I think this is the last information item. So next month we'll be asking on July 3rd, virtually be asking you to make a recommended motion on the solicitation. And so if there's either pros and cons of the 3 scenarios that you'd like to illuminate to bring to TAB's attention, that would be good. If there's other technical feedback that on the scenarios or other rules that we followed, didn't follow, those would all be good things. And if there's other tweaks, I think, Madam Chair, that was another maybe area that you wanted to think about a little bit this meeting, right?
Yep. So thank you. Steve will run through kind of a summary. And our goal for today is to take a look at those 3 scenarios and think about what feedback you want to give TAB. Right now, there isn't a lot of differences between the three scenarios. So are there things that this committee would like to suggest that would help create some more differentiation between those three scenarios to help TAB weigh their decision ultimately? TAB's gonna meet next week, and they'll give some additional direction to staff as this item moves forward then to the decision-making process, starting with funding and programming. So our input from today will be very timely and helpful for TAB and for Met Council staff as they try to refine these scenarios and bring it forward. So this is an information item today, but I do want to facilitate the conversation and try to gauge where you are all at as a committee through show of hands, for example, so that we can represent the committee's thoughts next week at TAB. So starting to look at, are there tweaks to the three scenarios that we already have before us that would help create that differentiation between them? And then starting to build a list of what we like or don't like about each of those scenarios, the pros and cons and whatnot. And then that will get refined when this committee meets again in July before the actual decision is made. And we do meet virtually in July. We are not in person in July. So don't come here unless you want to log in from your laptop. So I think that's the framing I wanted to provide. And then Steve, you and I can just kind of tag team and, however this body wants to take up the conversation kind of as we go through or kind of listen to the summary, just raise your hand when you're ready with some thoughts, so.
Okay, thank you. And so the lists have not changed from what you saw last month. We did have a few requests for additional information. We had the percent of the top scoring project in each of for each of the applications. I think Lyndon, you had asked for a summary of the breakdown of the federal funds in greater detail, so that it was provided. And then at funding and programming, the last funding and programming, they did ask for what we did last time, which was a list that compared the three scenarios and the differences between them so that the policymakers could try and pick out some different technical details or policy details from either the key outcomes or how many projects got funded. So that was a new item that you haven't seen, and we'll go through that today. So those are the three new items. Project list hasn't changed, but just to re-ground you in what we talked about last month in 1A, we put together three scenarios. Scenario one is also, I'll call it the closest to the midpoint that we could get based. And I say that because, as we talked about last time, 30% of the money for transit and TDM, we didn't have enough projects submitted, so we did have to, we didn't quite get there on transit, but we did get as close as we could to that 30% given the projects that were submitted. Scenario number two, we'll call is the safety scenario. Similar in nature to the first one, although it funds one additional roadway reconstruction project that we looked at the monetized crash benefit and picked out kind of the next project on the list that had the best safety benefit. And so that's the differentiation between one and two. And on the third one, bike ped heavy. So we looked at those modal funding ranges. And again, for bike ped, the midpoint is 14.5% of the total federal funds, and that range that TAB established was 9 to 20%. So we went to that top of that range. So we took 20% of the federal funds, and that amounts to about $15 million. So we shifted that. It's largely shifted from transit because, again, we didn't have enough transit projects submitted. So most of that shift is coming from transit for full disclosure. And so it's about $50 million, and we'll show you just briefly again where those went, but mostly went to the multi-use trail projects because we had that huge list of multi-use trails and bicycle facilities, and so that's where most of that $15 million went. So in addition to that, we do have that new regional sales tax money, the active transportation. So we have $15.8 million of active transportation dollars that we have put in to this solicitation to act as a grants management pilot because, as we talked about last month, state aid won't be administering the grants. We had some good questions from this body last month about how that will work. We've had a couple meetings since then with state aid and others to try and think about how we might approach managing those grants, and more to come on that front. But $15.8 million we put into this regional solicitation for that pilot project. So total funding across the 3 scenarios, $263 million. Don't need to go through all these. These are kind of the footnotes to where the monies and the colors come from. But shown within here is 10% over programming. So we did put in $25 million of over programming. If TAB did want to add another smaller project here or there, they could do that if that kind of made this scenario work. We also added in carbon reduction, protect money, and then there's some details on the active transportation money. So one thing that was asked of us at the active transportation work group that some of you sit on was what's the geographic distribution of those 14 projects? So those would go to 13 cities in 1 county, and we do think there's pretty good geographic balance as best you could get with a pilot, to tell you the truth. And that would go to projects within 6 of the 7 counties. So, if we're trying to kind of stick it into our system, it's about as good as you can probably hope for a pilot project, that is. So those are some of the other programming details, and now we'll shift over to, unless there's
Could I ask a quick?
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Question? Thank
Yep.
you, Chair, Steve. Can you just share the piece on the transit? We didn't get enough projects to get to the recommendation from TAB percentage-wise. How much percentage did we fall short of? And what that dollar figure is?
Sure, thank you, Madam Chair and Kathleen. Let me get to that, zoom in if I can here. So this is one of the last pages in the scenario. So again, remember we first came to you for the base funding, that's 200 million, and we did the midpoint. So we got the percentages just about as perfect as we could get, and that's at the top of the screen here. But then, as we started developing the scenarios and put more money in, so here's the, oops, this is not working on here, but you can see the row with transit percentage for midpoint is 26.8%. And for the safety, it's 24.6%. So again, the lower end of that modal funding range is 25%. So it's 25 to 35%. So that's one of the comments we did receive from F&P was that you're on scenarios 2 and 3, you're sitting at 24.6 and 24.8. So you're just shy of the bottom end of that range. And so one of the comments was, well, should we adjust that? So from a technical standpoint, we hit that 25%. It's a couple tenths of a percent, you may say, but it's probably one project. And there's 2 projects still on the board for transit, about $2 million apiece. So say if you funded one of those 2 projects, you'd get over that 25% threshold. But it's kind of up to this group and TAB if that's important or not, too.
Go ahead, Jim.
Madam Chair, Steve, when the scenarios were developed, was the active transportation funding contemplated? You have 2 sets of tables on this chart. Mm-hmm. Which one was the basis for the funding scenarios?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great question. The legislation for the active transportation dollars say that the money cannot supplant other funding. So the way we treated the development of the scenarios was it was above and beyond all the $15.8 million of active transportation was above and beyond the modal funding ranges or scenarios. So we didn't, we developed the scenarios first and then sprinkled in the money is the approach we used there. Because I think that was brought up at TAB as you can't kind of take money out to put this new money in. Had to be extra money.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, another question. I'll just keep you up.
And see,
Yeah. So at our last meeting, we talked a little bit about the fact that as this new metro area sales tax continues to move forward,
it's building up approximately 20 to 25 million per year. I know it was slated for 15 million for this regional solicitation as a pilot. Understanding that it's still gonna take some time to develop the true program for that. Was there any discussion through the working group to add a little bit more? And the reason I ask that is now is the time to talk about that, as we look at these 3 scenarios. Because potentially you could grab a few more pedestrian projects on there, if that's really what the public's wanting to see. And I saw the note there with public comments, so.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and good question, Joe. We heard, I guess you and others mention that at the last meeting. We broached that idea with the active transportation work group last time, and we said, would you want to put in more dollars into this pilot project? Because there's good projects right on the board here. Do we, these projects in front of you, do you want to fund them? And at this time, that group said they weren't interested in expanding the pilot beyond the $15.8 million. And I think the main reason, you were there, Chair Hager, was because there wasn't kind of a uniform agreement that we should have a bigger pilot and use that to go further down these lists. Am I capturing that? Kind of maybe what you heard? And
Yep.
that some people are on both sides of the issue. So the active transportation group said, well, if people are on both sides of it, we'd rather hold tight.
So the way I understood it from our last TAC meeting was the question was asked, and it was asked in the context of the bike ped heavy scenario doesn't appear to be very bike ped heavy or very different from the other 2 scenarios that were on the table. And so is there some consideration for adding more of the active transportation funding in order to create a more bike ped heavy scenario? So when I shared that with TAB and with the active transportation working group, I framed it as it was not a majority consensus from TAC to add more funds into the pilot. Our interest is that the pilot is successful, but TAC very much was questioning why the bike ped heavy scenario itself did not appear to be quote unquote bike ped heavy. So if I got that wrong, I apologize, but that was how I represented it. And so the active transportation active transportation work group heard that and said, well, we're not hearing enough to push us to add more money into the pilot from the technical group. They also wanted to ensure that the size of the pilot was such that it could be successfully done. So, do you have a follow-up, Elaine?
I was going to say, part of that was when you're looking at the bike ped heavy, the staff went to the top of the modal funding range for that 20%. And the not being very visible as bike ped heavy is because there's the limitation of staff to go to that top of that modal funding range. One of the things that the technical staff could discuss is, the technical committee should discuss is whether to look more like a bike ped heavy, would you recommend that TAB goes above that 20% with the federal funding? Staff was limited to that, top of that range. And then if you want to recommend that TAB discuss that, that is something they could do. And then when TAB brings it back for the action with their recommendation, the technical committee could then make that recommendation to add more federal funding, even beyond the, and that's something to have a discussion here if you would think, you want TAB to think about that.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you. And then one follow-up question on this, since we're on that topic, is, so with these projects, there's going to be various entities that will be given the sales tax, which is state dollars versus federal dollars. Just a follow-up question to the last meeting is, would those agencies and those projects be held to federal requirements? And then also, there was a good discussion at F&P, which related to if those projects are awarded state funds, because it's through the regional solicitation, are they still exempt from receiving HSIP funds if that project was submitted through that? I thought that was a really good question that came up during that meeting. So just seeing if there's any support on that. My recommendation, at least on that second part of the question, would be, since it's through regional solicitation, if they receive money through the regional solicitation, they would not be allowed to also receive, no matter what color of money, they would not be allowed to receive HSIP funds.
That's my opinion.
Okay.
Not the whole group's.
Let's take it in chunks. So the first question is whether agencies receiving the active transportation funding, the state funding, would be held to federal standards. So my understanding is that the local match will continue to be required in this pilot program because these agencies applied on, thinking they were applying for federal funds. So the local match will continue to be part of what agencies need to provide. But the actual project delivery process that comes with federal dollars will not apply. And so that's this pilot project that Met Council is going to be figuring out, is going to kind of figure out those details of how involved does Met Council staff get in, the details of project design and delivery and whatnot in the pilot. So from a federal process standpoint, the local match will apply. And I think from the technical committee's perspective, we accept that in the pilot, but I think our feedback has been that going forward, we don't think the local match should apply to these state funds, but we accept that during the pilot because of the circumstances of how this is coming together. Does that answer most of your question on that part?
Yeah, Madam Chair, most of it, I was just referring to like TE goals and all of that.
Okay.
I know last time we didn't know that answer.
Yep.
I was wondering if that working group had any more input on that.
Elaine, go ahead.
They will be discussing in the next, I think that's one of the topics on their next meeting is what requirements will be needed, because if it's not DBE, the Met Council has MCUB, so that could be its replacement. Or so there's going to be discussion of what parts for the administration. So the working group will make some recommendations for the staff on that, on how these projects will be managed. So it's to be determined.
Yeah, Madam Chair, maybe just to follow up on that, just to add to that, maybe a comment from the peanut gallery here is from TAC, at least one member would support not having any of those requirements as this is state funding. Keep this as simple as possible. It's a pilot program. Let's just get the money spent and get these projects put together. So I don't know if others would support that.
It would be helpful for me at this point to do that raise of hands to see if there's consensus with that general sentiment. So so specific to the pilot project, how does the committee feel about some of the requirements that come with federal projects like SUBP goals, DBE goal, that might be a Minneapolis thing, sorry. DBEs and the targeted business groups. So show of hands if you think that they should not apply in the pilot, please. You guys are gonna make me count because you're like so close to
It's only
split.
If the concern is meeting requirements, a lot of local agencies already have their own goals and targets. We're talking about $15 million here. I think the subcommittee could be better focused on what is when we put the mini solicitation together next year or whatever that, let's focus on that because these are some big decisions and the unknowns. I mean, we're on a tight time frame here, so that could be quite a discussion with that subcommittee because there's a lot of different positions.
Go ahead, Brian.
My only thought is that if it's a pilot, it should be shaken down as much as it can, and I get the timeframes are short, but taking a pass on it, I don't know that that's the right thing. I think you want to try something and see if it works, rather than waiting. That'd be my recommendation.
So if we think about this in the context of what we ultimately are looking for in the program, which would be to streamline and not tie requirements that come with the federal process to the state dollars, how do you feel about how you set the pilot up, given that perspective?
I don't know, I still, that's where I'm coming from.
You're coming from, okay.
Madam Chair.
Hold on, okay, so Elaine was first.
Part of it, so the committee will be looking at, because the staff does need to know how to administer these programs, so there has to be some kind of approval of doing it differently. So that was, and there was technical committee members along with the TAB members on the active transportation work group. So there will be discussion of how to do that. I think, most of the entities have some type of local, and they may not say complete federal, but there'll be some scaled back of what works, what doesn't, and that will be discussed, and I think within a couple months, they should have an idea of what can be utilized.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to Joe, because it started here, and then we'll go around. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Okay, yep, starting to jump in front here. So then, I know Stephen mentioned, since our last meeting, there was also some discussions with state aid about, okay, how would we administer this program? Where did that conversation go? Is state aid gonna help with these state-funded projects, or is that back to Met Council staff?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Joe. So we did have a 90-minute meeting with Mark Breezy and friends at State Aid. And they are not going to be administering the projects. The council will be administering the projects. We did get a lot of good feedback. For instance, one of the things we talked about was program year. Because with the federal funds, it's stricter as to the program year. And we've said for this pilot, you just need to be, I think the language Mark recommended was maybe have a construction contract by the end of calendar year 2026. Because the money doesn't go away, it sits in a bank account until used. So it's a little different than the federal funds, so that was one topic we talked about. I think we heard last month at TAC that a streamlined process from the grants management perspective was a good thing. The details we haven't worked out yet, but we need feedback from our active transportation group, and TAB is the ultimate decision maker on what we do or not. But I think we brought to TAB last month that some of this feedback was try and make it as easy as possible. The reason it's not federal money, we don't want to tie you up in all the restrictions of it. But, there's a lot of details in there too. So that's what we're working through now and talking to people on, and what we bring back to the work group of active transportation.
Okay.
Clarify what?
Okay, go ahead.
Just, thank you. To clarify, these aren't state funds, they're local sales tax funds going, that's why MnDOT will not be administering it, because it's not state funding.
Even more flexible.
Yep.
Adam?
Yep, thank you, Madam Chair. Just to emphasize the points that Steve was talking about, these are local funds. If there's a way that we can make the process faster, it's not follow each one of the federal reporting elements. It's not that the intent isn't there to do those things, as you point out. We all have a lot of these requirements from our local agencies and jurisdictions. It's really how do you provide a faster way to more efficiently distribute and test these funds. And I would suggest that maybe after a year or two, if it's not working or the results aren't right, then we can come back and say, well, maybe we really wanted to include this as part of a bigger federal project, and we needed to make it compliant anyway, so we could take a different approach in the future. But just for the purpose of quicker administration and be able to apply those funds simpler and cut back on the reporting, I think there's advantages to do that.
Go ahead, Lissa.
I've sat in on some of the active transportation work groups, and I think it's tough for that group to make decisions about federal requirements when a lot of them don't understand them. So one, I want to clarify, the question you just asked, was that all federal requirements or DBE specific? Because I think from a policy perspective, it's very difficult for me to raise my hand and say, nope, don't comply with the DBE. That's right. When everybody has policy. A lot of people have goals in order to increase, I'm just going to use the word equity, but I think it would be helpful for that group to streamline the discussion, and I think a lot of them would be very uncomfortable from a policy perspective saying waive that. On the flip side, obviously going through the federal environmental process. No, we're not doing that, I wouldn't think. So anyway, if we could compartmentalize that a little bit, but I also think it would be helpful if staff could pull a few of the local goals. So like if MnDOT has a goal typically of what they attempt to achieve when there isn't federal money, if Ramsey County, if Washington, so if locals do have those goals, I think it would be helpful for that group to say, oh, most of the groups already have some sort of internal goal that is unrelated to federal. So then that potentially could help them more comfortably state they are out loud that they are okay waiving the DBE. Because I think just generally that is a hard thing for people to say when they know that their entities do have equity and workforce goals, if that makes sense. So if we could pull a little bit of that data, I think that would help channel that working group, since a lot of them are probably not familiar with the different layers of what people try to achieve.
I agree with that.
I 100% agree with that. And so I did provide that active transportation working group with kind of a high level like, here's what it means to deliver a project in the federal process, which was eye-opening for many of them, even though it was extremely high level. So maybe if we could ask that we actually pull together a summary for that working group of what the quote-unquote federal delivery process is, what elements are contained in there, and then start to provide some recommendations about which of those elements might be met in other ways, and which of the elements this group might eventually recommend need not apply for whatever reason to the active transportation funds, which are local funds. Could we do something like that?
Madam Chair, I think we would have to engage state aid, and maybe perhaps they'd even have to give that presentation, but I think we could do it. We've tried in the past, usually through state aid is who have helped us do that, because it's similar to defederalization when we've talked about those type of projects. So gathering what I think we have in the past gathered, who has DB or similar requirements from different counties and cities. So I think that would be something we could do as well.
Chair, if I could just suggest, if any entity is getting the state money, if you could just send Steve, if you have a goal or a policy or something you try to work through, that just might streamline
Yeah.
it. So if you're on the list for this money, that might be helpful to save them the work of having to look it up.
And again, the DBEs and whatnot are just one aspect.
Correct.
So, I guess, yeah, take a look at how you would deliver the project, and if there's anything that you think links to some of the other steps in the federal delivery project, like looking at environmental considerations, like looking at disadvantaged communities and how you might mitigate some of those impacts. We could start with that sharing, and then I think we should see where the summary comes together. Alyssa, your comments are well put, well stated, I agree, so thank you. Go ahead, Adam.
Madam Chair, I wonder if the council's goals on DBEs and other things, so the Met Council already has goals, and if it's covering the region, that might be something to consider too. Just for thought.
Yeah, Madam Chair, that's something we're exploring internally too, because the council will be administering the projects, whether we might be held to something anyway, so.
Okay, Jim?
And Madam Chair, just regarding DBE, but other aspects as well, if there are, I'm not sure it's a bad thing necessarily to have a variety of approaches and to evaluate the results of those approaches at the end, maybe compare them to regional solicitation projects that are of same size, similar character, that are going on in the same years, and see what the results are.
Lyndon?
Yeah, Madam Chair, my question was based on the discussion. You said tab added lane on the head bike heavy percentage. Is that something that we could put those ranges in this funding table?
Tab approved ranges?
Yeah, add the ranges.
Because you mentioned 20% as being the top of the head bike. So it looks like under the scenario without the active transportation money, the bike ped heavy, is at 20.6. So that's the top of that range already, right, is what you're saying?
Right, yep.
You add the active money, and that's another 5%. So I was surprised they said that, when you're already at the max.
Yeah, I think they're looking at the federal before the active transportation, that it didn't change much.
But it's still at the max of the range.
Yeah.
Right? Do you remember what we did last time? What the percentage of the bike ped? Was it at the max or higher than the max?
Yeah, Madam.
Go ahead, Steve, yep.
So we went, remember last time we had a lot of money that came in late. It was including the carbon reduction. And so I think and we put all the carbon reduction dollars, like 15 projects, on bike ped. And in doing so, we did go slightly above the range. I think we were about 20 to 21%, Joe, right?
Yeah, so we're in the ballpark.
Yep, last time.
So I would just suggest that even under the base or the scenario without active, we're already at the bike ped heavy is already over the top of the range.
So I just want to, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the next meeting of the active transportation work group is July 25th. Does that sound right?
I think there's one in June,
Yeah,
Madam
there's one in
Chair. I
June.
think it's
Did I miss
after,
one?
it's after the tab meeting though. I think it's June.
Oh, there it is, sorry, 27th. Okay. Okay, so the next meeting of that work group is June 27th. So I'm just thinking through, this is a really good conversation and super helpful to provide some feedback to that working group and Tab as well. And how we might be able to kind of summarize some of this, hopefully for that next meeting, if they're going to start talking about these metrics and requirements at that next meeting. So go back to Joe. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, just one more comment on the DVE or different programs like that. So just looking at the list of potential recipients of this funding, I would say that there's likely several of these agencies that do not have a program like that, or maybe don't have a local goal for that. And I think, again, the intent of this pilot program is to get the money out there as quick as possible. So if the discussion starts to slant towards, we really want that pilot program to be aiming towards some type of DVE goal, it is a lot of work for these agencies that don't have a program to have to jumpstart something like that. And just knowing that from personal experience with our program, just keep that in mind. I'd recommend keeping that in mind with that working group. Thanks.
So Anoka County piloted a program in coordination with the DOT, MnDOT, when you did a federal swap, correct?
Correct. It was a joint effort through MnDOT and Anoka County to develop that program. And there's a lot of work behind the scenes to get that going. Sounds easy at the front, but if that would be the intent, I think that's something that should be saved for ultimately that future state where there's a separate solicitation. Again, I think this pilot is to get the early money out early. So there's likely some agencies here that don't have a local program.
And did Anoka County have a program before that pilot? No. So perhaps providing a summary of kind of what that all entailed would be helpful context as well.
Sure.
Kathleen.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to Elaine's question about whether, this committee thinks that we should be having more differentiation or pushing the boundary on those recommendations coming from TAB. So I don't have a lot of years of experience within this framework of how out of bounds that is to push back on TAB related to those boundaries that they set. But I would say that I think creating some more differentiation between these three scenarios would make a lot of sense. And in particular, when looking at the difference of the scenarios, what gets funded within the roadway scenarios and the bike ped related categories, and how much differentiation we see relative to that % of total points. So if the points and the way we score these projects are a reflection of what as a region we deem worthy, and we're going down into the 30s on some projects and some categories versus not getting to the mid 80s and others in a scenario which is intended to be bike ped heavy, I think that's a little bit hard to navigate and understand. And even within the roadways, the different subcategories of roadway, thinking of bike ped heavy, spot mobility, there's strategic capacity, and there's roadway reconstruction and bridges. And the three that in my mind have a lot of bike ped impact are bridges, roadway reconstruction, and spot mobility and safety. And those are the three that are either equal or have less projects funded compared to strategic capacity. So I don't know if that's an accurate depiction of how to think about bike ped within that category, but there might be some differentiation even within how we distribute funds in the scenarios relative to roadway construction, roadway projects within the subcategories.
Let's see, I don't know who was first over here.
I have mine's related to that or others.
Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
I would like to ask this group if there's been, I think, enough people that have questioned why the bike heavy isn't bike heavy. We understand this group does, that it hit the modal range. I'm not quite certain that everybody on TAB processed that. And so I think it's up to this group to say, hey, we are trying to stay within the modal range as TAB you set as policy, but if there's enough people asking this question, and if we're trying to get a decision out of TAB by July, I think we have to show them an actual bike heavy scenario that goes over the range and show them what that means next week. And I think unless we get...
5% over the range.
It's not 5% over the range because we have to look at because that state money cannot supplant the federal money.
0.6% over the range, the max.
Correct, but I'm saying if people are stating this isn't showing them enough of a difference, and we are trying to get a decision out of them in July. I'm not stating one way or the other whether it's accurate. I think it's up to this group to say, hey, direct Met Council staff to throw another scenario at TAB next week to show them an actual difference and then how far over the range that is and what the impact is. Because I think we will do this again at TAB, and I'm not quite sure that's helpful if that's just what they're gonna ask for again. And once, again, I'm not here to say one way or the other whether that's a good idea. I think it's up for this group to say, as technical staff, we recommend at least showing TAB a scenario that blows the modal range out of the water so they can at least see what that means and what the impact is. If we don't collectively think that's a good decision, that's fine, but I think it would be helpful for TAB to understand whether or not we had the discussion and what our actual recommendation was or not.
Respond.
So just to make sure this group knows, that doesn't necessarily mean that TAC is recommending the bike ped heavy scenario.
Correct.
But we are trying to help TAB maybe move beyond kind of a framework that they set, frankly, before the applications were even in and they knew what they were dealing with. And so giving them a recommendation. So I think we could try to provide that scenario to them for next week, Lissa, or we could simply provide a consensus from this group that TAB consider going outside of the modal funding range and then let them tell Met Council staff, you know, go outside of it by this amount of percent or this number of projects or some sort of metric to help them build that scenario leading up to funding a program. So there are a couple different options there I just want to throw. And then Elaine has a clarification.
I want to add on, when TAB's had discussion on the modal funding ranges, they looked at them as ranges and some guidance, not that they were policy and set. So because when they're adopted by one TAB, and then now we've got a new TAB the following year, so they can make different decisions. But it was a starting point to look at having some discussion, so those aren't set in a stone. So if the committee wanted to recommend that, they could take that under advisement.
So we do not have, this is an information item, we do not have an action item before us, but if I could again ask for a show of hands, would this group support sharing feedback to TAB that we feel that they should ask for Met Council staff to build a bike ped heavy scenario that goes above the high number of 20% in the bike ped categories and see what that looks like for further consideration. So going here.
Madam Chair, I think if we start playing around with the scenarios outside what's shown here, we need to think about really what is that threshold that we start taking from to build, whether it's, you know, whether it's bike ped or another category that we start building up. What is the minimum points that is allowed here for scoring? Because some of these are being shown as funded under certain scenarios that don't even have half the points. So, I mean, we need to think about that as well, because I know that was a concern as TAB as well. So, it's, if we're going to build up one category, you have to take from something with some parameters.
Yeah, Madam Chair, along those lines, I think looking at minimums is important as well. If we're going to be recommending going above the modal ranges, I mean, in the transit category as an example, we're not meeting the minimums, but we're still taking dollars from transit to fund other categories. I don't see why we wouldn't recommend a scenario that at least hits the minimums for all categories. So I think that needs to be considered in this recommendation as well.
Okay.
Madam Chair, and that's one thing that did come up at funding and programming was transit was on the lower end or out of the range on some of these scenarios. And I think this is the first time that's happened. So just acknowledging that the midpoint is the option that actually properly funds within the ranges for transit specifically. So just making a note of that.
Go ahead, Jim.
Madam Chair, and Steve, maybe there's a scenario that reflects that meets the new greenhouse gas emissions requirements better than others. And if there's not, would there be value or benefit in developing such a scenario?
Steve, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair and members. You could put together a scenario like that. I think think next cycle we'll have better data because we'll have the multimodal GHG reduction study done, among other things. I mean, I would say it's probably similar to the bike ped heavy. If I were to, like, which one of these would do that, it's because we funded almost all the transit projects, and then you're kind of shifting more to bike ped, so that maybe would be the closest thing we have that's on the board to that. But we'll have more data, I think, in the next cycle, we're definitely gonna have more data and evaluation of project types and where would be the best place to go.
All right, so can I get a show of hands for who on the committee supports sharing with TAB that we feel that they should ask for a bike ped heavy scenario that might go above the modal funding range by some amount? Do you have something on this?
Before you
first?
ask that question, could maybe we consider, because then you're pulling money from the other modes, what if one of the options is, if you want to go more heavy on bike ped, that you do dip more into the active transportation money, and it makes it politically a little more palatable than taking away you're adding new. So I just throw that out there. Maybe some people would be more open to that than taking away from roadways or transit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would defer to Met Council staff on the feasibility of a bigger pilot program.
Chair, the working group already said they didn't want to add money to that. So I think that we'll just go back to a circular discussion of then TAB saying, well, what did the working group say? The working group just said last week. So once again, I don't think it's off the table, but the working group was asked the question, they talked about it, they didn't see a technical reason to do so or hear one, and then they went right back to say, no, why would we do that? So I'm just trying to end the circular arguments that are going to happen at TAB next week, which is probably an impossible task, but.
Yeah. To answer to.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay,
Yep.
just to answer Michael's question here. There's a few, if you wanted to go with the proposal on the table, there's a couple ways you could get there, and Michael's alluding to one of them. Add more active transportation. We asked a second time around to that group. Some of them said, why are you asking us again? We already gave you direction on that. So that was maybe a dead end. The other option is using a little bit more over programming. And, we probably you probably can get up to maybe another $4 to $5 million of over programming. And maybe you say, we're gonna put all that towards bike ped. And now you get a couple more projects on the board. That's another option. The other thing, you can see the far column here, number 3, the bike ped heavy. What we did as staff is we put almost all of that money on the trails, because you can see how long this list is. So one comment we heard last month at this group was, well, maybe you should split it up so that each of these categories in bike ped heavy gets more projects. So so you can kind of rearrange what you have. You could add a little bit more over programming, and I think active transportation is maybe a dead end at this point unless TAB says otherwise. But those, and just kind of hearing the conversation, those are the kind of the avenues I would foresee us going down if people wanted to add more bike ped.
So I'll just note that this group is quickly getting to kind of, the issue of picking winners and losers with these different scenarios, and that's the same thing that TAB's gonna struggle with. So what we can do is provide a recommendation to them with these options for how to make something like that happen, or we can probably spend the next 40 minutes trying to build the scenario ourselves and not get very far. So just throwing that out there as you're thinking about how you wanna frame this ultimately with TAB. Go ahead, Elaine.
One thing, Joe, to Mike's comment of just adding active transportation, that doesn't change the bike heavy calculation for the federal funds.
Correct, yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be in favor of putting more in bike and ped and taking away from other.
That was what she was
personal.
questioning.
So I'm just trying to find a happy medium here to get more money or show a scenario to make that doable.
And again, we're not necessarily saying TAC is recommending that scenario, but all we want to do is provide TAB with choices that actually look different. But if we put 3 ducks in front of them and they all look like ducks, how are they gonna make a decision about which one to pick? So that's kind of the goal, is not necessarily to decide on which scenario today. So go ahead, Jim.
Madam Chair, we're talking about an additional scenario, am I right? Are we 3 ducks or 4 ducks?
So I believe at this point, it would have to be a pretty, like, amazing scenario to put something new on the table at this point. We're not eliminating anything at this point, but I think it would have to be something like really wow and different and something we think TAB's gonna latch onto, that would result in a new scenario at this
And
point.
just a comment, then, I would not support an additional overprogramming or, beyond ranges for a bike ped scenario, because I don't think it's realistic that that can get approved. Outside the funding ranges, TAB usually won't go there. I mean, if it's a fourth scenario, I'd support, looking at it.
Noted. Okay, so this group is still considering how you want to frame this for TAB. And I think the sentiment that TAB for many years has just kind of gone back to the midpoint as their go-to scenario, they might need to hear from the technical group about why looking at something different should be on the table. So I think there are some hands over here before I go back over here. No? Okay. Anyone on the list? Go ahead, Adam.
Just so I'm clear, the active transportation there's two sets of three. One set includes active transportation funding in it, and the other one doesn't include it in the percentages. And so does it make sense? Because I'm just thinking active transportation project types are going to be bike ped projects anyway. And so if there's active transportation projects, so there's more projects by virtue of that even being there. Use the set of three on the left of the screen and have the additional 15 million or whatever it is for active transportation, because that still supports the same thing without shifting the pots of money around.
And I do think it is challenging to present this in a way that everyone can understand, because to Alyssa's point earlier, the active transportation funds are meant to be on top of the federal regional solicitation funds. They're not meant to kind of supplant or supplement what we're getting in terms of these scenarios and these percentages. So it's hard when it's all shown on one table. And I think that's good feedback. I know we spent already an hour with our new TAB member trying to just walk through how to read the table. So that's a lot. Go ahead.
Chair, might I suggest that summary to TAB is that TAC talked about it at length, and there didn't seem to be a technical reason to create a fourth scenario. But if TAB felt from a policy perspective that was something they wanted to see, that TAC's recommendation to them is to give Met Council staff some bounds of X amount of projects, or don't go past 50% of the total scoring, or up to whatever it might be. And that seems to be the tone of the discussion, because I'm not against it if that's where they want to go, but it does not seem to be that there's enough there to really force it.
Go ahead,
I
Elaine.
just want to remind, TAB did hear the regional solicitation survey results that was done for the regional solicitation dollars themselves, active transportation. That was not part of that. And the public, through that survey, I mean, it's a small scope of representing people in the region. There was a recommendation for higher bike ped. And so that was one of the sources of input that TAB is going to be considering.
Go ahead, Lyndon.
Just to remind everyone, like you all know that deliver these jobs, that every roadway project, every transit job has a significant bike ped infrastructure investment in it. So we put a ton of money in those with the roadway and transit projects.
Joe?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'll just add to, with the one-on-ones that Met Council had, in preparation for some of these discussions, and just feedback from the different agencies on where they see some shortfalls and what are some of the positive things to the regional solicitation process. I think one thing that seemed to be pretty key was those ranges, and the discussion of those ranges. I know that many of the folks I talked to, the ranges, although they're guidance, a lot of people see them as policy by the time they get developed, because think of all the discussion that goes into setting those range types that happens within TAB, happens within these groups. So I would have a hard time recommending something outside of that although it's guidance, because that's something TAP did take a vote on and move forward, that's their range. So all of us know that when we're applying. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but that's something to keep in mind as we move forward.
I agree, and that's one of the reasons why the scenarios are built the way they are right now. And so this group can consider simply recommending to TAB that they consider asking for something that's outside of those ranges and give them the reasons why that might make sense. So again, I think this group's getting a little hung up on picking winners and losers and, which scenario might ultimately get selected. That's not the point we're at right now. Our goal here today is to provide some feedback to TAB so that they can give direction to Met Council staff to help provide some differentiation in these scenarios so that they can actually pick which one they want. So they need to see the implications, right, of the different scenarios in those choices. And right now, I don't think that those are very apparent. So here's the order. Matt, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not necessarily advocating that we, not in the vein of picking winners and losers, but again, getting back to the minimum discussion in terms of the modal ranges. I'm wondering, can we at least have this committee, not necessarily recommend, but just note to TAB that in the two scenarios, the safety and bike ped heavy, that transit is not meeting the minimum modal range set by TAB. Is that something that this committee is okay, just making a note to TAB at the end of the day, something for them to consider?
That seems like
to
an
be
easy
aware of.
one to do a show of hands right now. Does anyone raise your hand if you think that's a bad idea?
Can you repeat it?
So we will let TAB know, we will make sure that TAB is aware that in both the safety and the bike ped heavy scenarios, transit is short of their minimum in the modal funding ranges, just so that they don't overlook that. Okay, we're all good with that. All right.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm gonna star that one in my notes, because that's clear for me right now. Okay. All right, who was next? Brian.
I'll just say, to Joe's point, I'll step off of that and say, those modal ranges have been around for a really long time, and they're based on what the previous, and if I'm really out of bounds, somebody say so, but my recollection is those were really based on the former federal funding pots. And in 2014, we were trying to get to the federal funds are a lot more flexible than we allow for, so we do it differently. But at the end of the day, we're kind of still doing it the same way if we stay within those ranges. And I think all I'm trying to do is to encourage TAB to say, you have a lot more flexibility with these federal funds than you're exercising. And so if you wanted to see scenarios that were different, or if you wanted to push one direction or another, it is entirely within your purview as policymakers to explore the funding flexibility that is there within those rules.
I think Jim was next.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think Brian brings up an excellent point. I think the TAB needs to explore whether those ranges should be broadened in the future if they want to evaluate scenarios that are really different from one another.
Kathleen?
Thanks, Chair. I would recommend, I support both of what you both just said, and, I think we've been talking about whether or not there is support from this committee, but we haven't actually heard from a lot of people. So I know twice, Chair, you've tried to have a show of hands and we haven't done it, but, so, I don't know, maybe we should hear from everyone, or just to get a little bit of a better understanding where people are.
Anyone else want to make a comment before we kind of do a show of hands here? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. So that the regional sales tax, or, in the 7-county metro area, $100 million. This is all new money going towards active transportation road, or not roads, but trails, bikeways, et cetera. So that can't be lost on the region, that we have this huge influx of formula funds going to the counties, and then also the additional solicitation specific to active transportation. So I guess it's not a comment for today, but maybe moving forward as we look at the 2026 solicitation process, and if they're reanalyzing ranges or guidelines, that there is a lot of money going towards bikes, trails, et cetera, through formula funding, new money.
Okay, so I am not hearing a lot of consensus from this group, so I am wondering if next week, if we framed this conversation to Tab in such a way where we are noting that there's flexibility, to Brian's point, there's flexibility in the federal funds that they are currently not exercising, that they are working within these modal funding ranges, and there is more flexibility if they would want to use that. And maybe framing it for them in terms of noting that there isn't a lot of differentiation currently within these three scenarios, and that working outside of those modal funding ranges, should they wish, could create more of that differentiation. And if you would like, I could be clear that at this time, TAC is not recommending any one scenario of the three that are before them. Is there any concerns with that summary for TAB next week? Or thoughts on how to reframe any of that? Go ahead.
Madam Chair, can you suggest that, looking at the modal ranges is a future task, not for something of this
Yep.
solicitation?
Any additional thoughts on that summary before we do share hands? Go ahead, Steve.
Madam Chair, I'd say, one of the things that we added that was new is a summary, it's too small, the summary page in the back, but I think it perhaps reinforces your summary where we looked at the three scenarios and the differences between them to say, technically, are we getting better outcomes in this area, or safety or equity bonus projects, or, and there's, I would say, very little difference because you're funding the top projects across all of the scenarios. The difference is on the margins of the 4 to 6 projects, the last kind of maybe 4 to 6 projects in. So in doing a rather exhaustive analysis of the differences, you have to look pretty hard to say this one's better than another one. And maybe that's a little bit what we're hearing here today too. So.
If we could do a show of hands on what I just summarized, and then maybe we can come back to talking a little bit more about ways to create that differentiation and see if we can provide some feedback on ways to do that that TAC either does or does not agree with from a majority standpoint. So kind of putting these into buckets, because taking one giant step isn't gonna happen here, but maybe a baby step towards kind of our thoughts on this. Again, I think TAB would greatly benefit from getting some feedback from this group, so I'm trying to find where we can agree on some of that feedback. So, do I need to summarize again, or is everyone clear? Okay, so if you are okay with us sharing from that summary with TAB next week, please raise your hand. Okay, good. So that will be at least step one. Now, if we can kind of go back and talk about some of the ways that if TAB wanted to see some refinement to these scenarios ahead of the decision-making process, ways that that can happen, things I wrote down from this conversation is consideration of a minimum score in order to be in a funded scenario, adding more active transportation funding to the pilot, noting that the working group has already made a decision on this, playing around with where the overprogramming goes or how much overprogramming is on the table. And then I just noted that there seemed to be a reluctance to pull funding from other categories to increase funding in any one area, and I don't know what that translates to in terms of the flip side of do versus not do. So those are the things that I've taken note of so far from our conversation. So maybe we could start with the minimum scoring option and see what the group thinks about that. If we wanted to make a recommendation to TAB regarding that, we could just make the recommendation that they consider minimum scoring, or we could be more specific and say we recommend that anything lower than 50% of the total possible points should not be considered. I'm just throwing 50 out there, just grabbing a number. It could be anything. So opening back up the floor for thoughts. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Madam Chair, just again recommending that if we are going to consider minimum scoring, that consideration also factor in the minimum modal range. And that if we dip a category below a minimum modal range, scoring really shouldn't be considered.
How do folks feel about that? Do we end up with anything different than what we have right now? Go ahead, Craig.
And that's kind of to my point before, was that I think other tab members have mentioned that you're not going to get anything different because you're still trying to meet that minimum. So we're trying to do something here maybe radical that would change. If you don't meet the 50%, then maybe it drops even lower. And that's just the reality of the scoring of that decision.
I don't know who was first, Joe or Elaine.
It's my
Go ahead,
birthday. Chair, I just want to caution about the, about scoring minimums and scoring percentages, that comparing across categories is really difficult. I think it's futile. And for example, in transit, I think we have very low scores in part because the transit scoring is set up to really give big points to the top score and a lot of big gaps. And then for another example, in trails and bikeways, that's really set up to have a lot of bunching and a lot of really high scores because applicants tend to apply when they get the full 200 points for RBTN. There's a number of scores that are qualitative that tend to be fairly high, and there's very few deductions in the risk assessment. One last example, and I'll step off the box. There's a highway category where everybody was supposed to get 0, but they all got 65 because the rules are to raise the points. So the scores they're reliable within each category. They're very unreliable category to category. So those minimums make me really nervous, and I'll leave that go for a while.
So if we're looking at a minimum % of the total possible scores, is that really comparing across categories? And another way to look at that is there could be a different minimum per category, so.
In my opinion, it is because
It's just a rhetorical for everyone to consider how they're looking at it.
well, in my opinion, it is because it's really difficult to score really low percentage in bikes and trails. And it's having only 3 transit applications and having certain scores that really create a lot of spread. I think that percentage, comparing percentage across categories is almost as futile as comparing points.
Noted. And I will remind this group that TAB has talked about kind of those scores a couple of times now, and noting that some categories have a very sharp cliff, while some have a very gentle fall off of points. So just throwing that out there and noting the challenges that you're putting on. I'm not disagreeing with you, Joe. I'm just sharing the flip side. I think Kathleen was next.
I was going to add on to that. If you do look at the scores, for example, the spot mobility safety projects get several lower scored compared to, say, the bridge category. So you start looking at scores of, the lowest bridge is 736. So, I mean, that's, you start shifting the funding within those if that's where you start going. So if you make a statement, you have to follow it all the way through.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To your point, Joe, I think the idea that somebody raised, I can't remember over here, that maybe it's different within each category could be reflective, because I do think there's so much energy that goes into how the scoring's set up, scoring the applications, and that is a value system of the region saying these projects are worthy, right? And so whether it's 50% in one category, 40, 80 in another, whatever it is, right? It's not about comparing across categories, the percentage, but within a category, like how much, everything is an opportunity cost within this solicitation, right? Like funding one project means not funding another or a couple or something like that. So that's a way that I would support as an option.
Innocent?
Yeah, Madam Chair. Yeah, I agree to what Joe was saying, because if you look at some of the highway categories, most of those projects, there are certain work, because due to the way the matrix or the measures are set up, some of the projects will score low because it's based on the number of volumes that the new, for example, if it's expansion project, and you're looking at ways of reducing the emissions or the VMT, when you add the expansion before and after, you see the find that before or the expansion stuff that's supposed to maybe reduce speed and improve the the congestion will end up scoring very low in emission because the expansion projects increase the VMT higher than what you had before, so you're not getting anything benefit. So they end up scoring 0 in most of the cases, and they end up having really low score. So we have to kind of look at that's very different if you look at different types of modes or different types of projects category that we're scoring.
Lisa?
Chair, are the ranges in this information anywhere? Okay, A, can we, what are the ranges? Can somebody
Right.
say that out loud or type that somewhere?
Have it up on my,
It should be on that funding summary. If you
Where-
could put it on that for tabs.
Which page?
That first one where we talked about, that, if we could add them there, that'd be
Oh, if we
very
can add
helpful.
them there, okay.
Yeah.
So staying on that page though, can somebody just out loud say what the ranges are quick?
I have them up. So
Okay.
modal funding ranges for roadways including multimodal elements is 46 to 65%.
Okay.
Transit and TDM is 25 to 35%. Bicycle and pedestrian facilities is 9 to 20%.
Thank you. Okay. That's helpful. And what I was going to say now makes sense. I was concerned it wouldn't. Is the recommendation to basically say, do a scenario that hits, if they're looking for, once again, if they're looking for bike ped, is to go to the bottom of the modal range, like that TAC is not comfortable saying 50% of the scores because there's too much variety between categories of how things are scored, but to say, go to the bottom of the modal range for roadways, and at a minimum, the minimum range to capture transit, and then high on everything, up to, then that gives more room for bike ped. I mean, that at least gives some technical bounds within the policy tab set of saying, once again, I am not advocating this will cut Washington County projects, but that at least gives a technical rationale to a scenario that isn't slicing scores, but drops within that quote-unquote policy bounds that tab set. And once again, I'm stating this knowing that Washington County projects are going to get cut in this scenario. So it's not something I will advocate that we actually support, but at least give some sort of rationale to what tab could consider. Since the roadway category, we're well within the range in every single one of the scenarios. So if you bump that down to the lower end of the range, get transit up to at least the minimum in the scenario, and then put the rest in bike ped, however you cut it, then that at least gives them an option to look at. Not advocating for it, but gives them a technical rationale that isn't slicing and dicing scores.
Digestion. Go ahead, Michael first.
Oh, I was just going to say, showing options, that's great, and then I would also suggest, what does roadways funded at 65% look like, and how much would it take away from everything else? Just to recognize the point that we are putting a lot in some of these other areas. So, we're all talking about bikeways and pedestrians, which is great, but roadways, we need a huge investment in roadways, and I think we should show more options, maybe, if we're gonna show one option.
Sure, yeah, do we show one that maxes out
Yeah, and I think
the
transit,
roadway category and bottoms out the other categories and vice versa? I don't think that's necessarily a bad option.
It's not possible. To stay within the minimums, you can't get to the top of the roadway category, I don't think.
So maybe that's the answer then, if we're trying to tell them to stay within the categories, but.
But we used to have sorry, Madam Chair, we used to have a road heavy and a bike ped heavy.
road heavy, yeah.
We had both. We went away from that last time. We've gone away from that here. So to Michael's point, should that be on the table?
Or end it all and say, let's just do the midpoint, because that's where we'll end up.
Well, I've been on this for 10 years, and it always hits at the midpoint, and we spin our wheels for hours.
Exactly. I was going to say tab, Madam Chair, usually doesn't like to see the minimum. The midpoint is where they're comfortable with. So I think that's why staff or always shows that. They're going to say, if you're going to fund one of these categories at minimum, that should be, whether that's bike ped or roads, I just don't think they're going to support that. So why show it?
Yeah.
But we're all comfortable with the math deciding. That's what we're saying when we say the midpoint is what we're gonna land at and what we're comfortable with. We're all comfortable with the math, doing all the work for the policymakers. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, Madam Chair, absolutely. I think the staff came up with some good scenarios, and they're realistic, and they're within the funding ranges, and they push some funding that, isn't meeting minimums over to the proper categories in one scenario. There's a safety, a high safety scenario. It doesn't change things a whole lot, but, I think those scenarios are realistic.
Joe?
I was just gonna mention, we've got, maybe the question to ask here is, does this group support the 3 scenarios that are in front of us? We talked about asking about adding more. What about the 3 scenarios in front of us? Where's the group at for that? Where are we at with those? I think a lot of work has gone into these, trying to find lines and.
Yep, and again, we're not saying they're bad scenarios or that we disagree with how they were come up with, but when you do look at them, and we didn't go through the tables much, Steve, but if you do look at them closely, you don't see a lot of difference in which projects are funded or not. And maybe, maybe that's okay. But I don't know right now how to advise TAB on how to pick between them because they do look so similar. So that's really, again, we're not picking today, but we are trying to provide TAB some guidance from our seat as technical staff for the next step. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, Madam Chair, it seems like any time that either the modal distribution is below minimum or you flag it like we talked about. And it also seems like if the scores maybe fall kind of out of whack, that we flag it. I don't know that you set a minimum, but I think to help with that conversation that TAB has to have, it seems like it makes sense that, there are flags like, hey, some of these projects are getting in here and they have lower scores maybe than they typically would. And you're gonna have different scoring across all the different categories, but it just seems like there's a flag that helps inform along those lines, and that we don't necessarily rely completely on the numbers, but again, giving that discretion to TAB and informing them at the same time.
Well, Madam Chair, just one more comment. So, and the reality always seems to be at the end, right? They end up looking from technical, we don't like this. They look at geographic balance. If there's some agency that doesn't have a project on there, they find it, usually, right? That will happen again if there's an outlier where somebody's not getting something. So just recognize they are politicians, a lot of them, so they're gonna be advocating for their project. If they're not on the list, they're gonna say, what about geography? It's gonna happen, no matter what the score of that project is.
It has happened.
It has happened several times, every time.
Yeah. Kathleen?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thinking about some of the comments that have been said and kind of how the last tab sets the range, this tab implements it. What is the range? What is the midpoint? It's been that way for decades, or what, some of these comments, it's like, is there a way that as a committee we could also reflect maybe on how these modal ranges tie back to our regional TPP and the policy goals and how those have changed over the past decades and how these ranges have or haven't changed. Like, I don't know the history. It'd be really nice to hear, to see that data about like, have these remained the same as our regional goals have changed? And is it a consideration? Is that part of the consideration?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Madam Chair and Kathleen, great question, and that's the whole objective of the regional solicitation evaluation that we're doing right now. I think Brian gave a good summary that the modal funding ranges are based on largely the federal funding sources from 93 to 2014. And then when we did this 10 years ago, the evaluation, that data from 1993 to 2013 made the ranges. So I guess if you trace all the way back, it's largely based on what those old funding amounts were for CMAQ versus STP versus TAP at that time and other things. And that's kind of eluded, and it probably takes a 10-year type evaluation like we're doing to relook at it. And it's tough to make incremental change kind of cycle by cycle.
Go ahead, Ken.
Might I recommend, like, because I know that analysis hasn't finished, that's at least a talking point within, like, we are looking at that with the next one. And so it further defines the point that this is, you know, people have talked about as guide, policy, direction, whatever, that it is something within their purview that they are able to discuss and, you know, adapt.
So it is 10:55 and we are going to start losing people probably in a few minutes. This is an information item, so we do not have action to take. I do have consensus on 2 clear talking points right now to bring back to tab next week that I noted from this group. And so before we start losing too many people, is there any other kind of main points that this committee would like shared with tab next week? Otherwise, what I intend to do is kind of summarize. These are the types of things we talked about, and there was no clear consensus from this committee on how you might, you know, use or not use minimum scoring, add or not add more money from the pilot, the active transportation fund, these 2 things that we talked about. So I'm not hearing or seeing any clear consensus on that right now. I liked your suggestion, Lissa, and I could put that on the table as well. We didn't do a show of hands on that, but go ahead.
Chair, to your point, I think the thing is missing, and to what Brian said, is are we going to let the math win, is potentially, TAB talked about safety endlessly, and we added so many points in safety. And so from a policy perspective, like, this group here is looking back at TAB of, like, what are you actually trying to achieve here? And the 2 things that have been talked about a lot are safety and active transportation. And so our ultimate question is, where is that policy direction on what wins here? Is it the math, or is it, because to me, the amount that TAB has talked about safety, that's the category in me that's rising up to the top because of the emphasis there. Now, that's a different question of whether this is actually going to achieve anything different than the other categories, but those sort of some policy things this group has not talked about and is kind of out of our purview. But unless we just go straight with math, then, you know, so getting TAB's direction maybe on trying to get them to talk more about what policy they are trying to achieve with this money, then that potentially could help us then in the next month to lean in a direction, as opposed to picking and winning and losers, which we're ultimately going to do anyway. But maybe will get us off that.
Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
And I don't want it to sound pejorative that we're letting them. I just think we all need to recognize that that's what we're doing. And I'm fine with that. And I think we're largely captive. And I'd say, to Kathleen's point, as we go into the regional solicitation evaluation, I think that that's something we should all be paying attention to, is that my opinion on all of this is that we have so many things baked into to each category, we get the same types of things regardless of how we want to push the lever on the ranges. And so as we think about the solicitation and categories, I think we should be thoughtful about trying to minimize the overlap of the various categories within each individual category, if that makes sense. Because we end up having a lot of the same things baked into each of the individual categories, and we end up with this, which is fine. And that seems to make the policymakers happy, and like largely we get things, but it doesn't allow us to pivot to say we want to address pedestrian fatalities, or we want to address fatals and A's and interchanges, or whatever it is. And that's all I'm trying to get us to be mindful of.
Joe?
So Madam Chair, what's the summary? Can you give us a recap of what's the summary of the active transportation one? Because we had a lot of discussion on that. What was the consensus we came to
So
there?
my understanding of the consensus from this group is that we would share with TAB a reminder that there is a lot of flexibility within the federal funds themselves, and that the modal funding ranges that they set last year as guidance, not policy, doesn't take advantage of the flexibility that they have. So reminding them that it is within their purview to work outside of those ranges if they want to see some more differentiation between these scenarios. We would suggest that looking at these modal funding ranges be part of the 2026 regional solicitation evaluation process, and suggest that these modal funding ranges, if they continue, be tied very closely to the goals and policy direction of the region, and make it clear that TAC at this time is suggesting that differentiation between these scenarios would be a good thing, but is not necessarily recommending any one of these three scenarios at this time. And then reminding them and being clear that transit is not meeting their minimum per those modal funding ranges in either the safety or bike heavy scenarios. And that is largely what I got from a consensus standpoint today, I think, but let me know if I got any of that wrong. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, on the active transportation side though, so Steve and Tab has a little more direction. Where did we come to on that? What was your understanding of what you heard today?
For the active transportation pilot,
Yes.
no change on, so the group talked about one way that you could create some differentiation is by adding more funding from the active transportation pot of money in the pilot project or program, noting that the work group has already made a decision around that, and so that would be a reconsideration of that decision. And you're talking about the federal requirements?
Yes.
I don't know if TAB is gonna get there next week, so we're gonna bring that back to the active transportation work group. And so the summary on that, so that's not for TAB next week, but the June 27th meeting of the active transportation work group, which you're all welcome to chime, to listen in on. I would ask that we bring back a summary of what's actually included in the federal project delivery process, noting which elements of that that might be especially important to TAB, might be covered through other local goals or metrics or policies, and getting them to really understand what the federal delivery process is, so that as we build out the pilot program for the active transportation funds, we are doing it in such a way that we are streamlining as much as possible while still not leaving behind anything that might be important to the policymakers. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
I hope the recording's still going, because I'll go back and capture all that later, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, anything else from this group that you want me to share or not share next week? Okay, Steve, anything else?
No, just some
you
other
want?
business, but I can wait. If you're not
What was
there.
that?
Just other business.
Okay, so then we are gonna move quick to other business, as we're starting to lose people, so go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly, the hardest working staff member we've got, Joe Barbeau here, he does a lot for this committee. His birthday here today, so we do have some cookies on your way out if you want a little appetizer before lunch. So thanks, Joe, for all you do for us.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Happy birthday. Anyone else in other business today? Thank you all for a great discussion. Thank you all for coming in person. I do think that it makes a lot of sense to have these difficult conversations in person. And so I appreciate you making that extra effort. Have a great day, everybody.
Got my date here.